The Gospel according to Mark, the 7th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Jesus said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then Jesus said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took the man aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears. He spat and touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. The Lord does what is fair for those who have been wronged, gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets the prisoners free. The Lord protects the foreigners. The Lord defends the orphans and the widows. Reading our psalm this morning from Psalm 146 reminds us of all the work God does in our world. I often find myself reminding myself of all of the ways in which God's work is active around us, partly because it helps remind me of all of the ways God is active in the world, in my life, but also it helps me to remember that God is calling us into this work. And as this is Labor Day weekend, it makes a little bit of sense that we're talking about works today, right? So what is God's work? If we look at our psalm today, if we look at all of our readings today, God's work is, well, everything, right? Everything is God's work. In Isaiah, God's work is giving strength to those in fear, saving those in danger, healing, giving joy, giving new life to all of creation. In our psalm, God's work is justice and care for those who are often excluded from those kinds of promises. Captives, those with disabilities, those who have lost their families, those who are considered the stranger. In James, God's work is reminding us that all of this life and healing and relationship we see God busy with in our world is also impartial. God's welcome, God's healing, God's justice isn't just for the rich and powerful. It isn't just for the people who are just like us. It's for all. And this work doesn't care who you are, James reminds us. And James tells us in a way that I appreciate Gordon's reading, but gosh, man, James is pretty harsh, and it makes me feel pretty inadequate, right? Because this work that God calls us to is not always easy and often difficult. In our reading from James's letter to the church, he calls out the way so many people of faith don't often live up to the impartiality, to that work that God calls us to. We might offer good tidings, thoughts, and prayers, but little in the way of change, of help, of resources and needed things. Every time I read this chapter from James, I am reminded of my own failures to live up to that calling. And I will say my Lutheran sensibilities get very upset by James's statements about faith and works. If you were with us on Bible study on Tuesday, while Gordon read the gospel then, that line, or read the reading from James then, that line where he says, "Can faith save you?" I muttered quietly to myself, well, yes, that's kind of the whole point, right? But the reality is, James isn't wrong. Because faith saves us, it saves our souls, it saves our lives, but faith without works does not save our neighbor. Faith that God will provide for our neighbor who is hungry and tired and without clothing, but not doing anything about it, does not save our neighbor. It can become easy for us to stick with what's comfortable, whether that's in church, in our work, in our hobbies, in any aspect of our lives. It's easier to share a Facebook post than it is to do something, right? It's easier to send a check than to actually be in relationship with those strangers on the outside. And it's easier to welcome someone who looks like us, talks like us, and has experiences similar to us than it is to welcome someone of a different age, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, cultural background, or socioeconomic background. All those distinctions that we create between each other. There's a reason James is so harsh in his letter. There's a reason it hits us a little bit right here. And it's because we're not that different from the early church. We all make these kinds of mistakes. And even Jesus, in his words to the Syrophoenician woman, they hit hard at my heart too, in a very different kind of way. Because that kind of callous response to a woman in need of help, it just is not the Jesus that I want to talk about, right? Jesus literally refers to this woman as a dog undeserving of his table scraps. And thinking that Jesus could refer to anyone as less than human because she is different, because she's outside of a preferred group, because of her gender, her ethnicity, her faith background, I can't believe that Jesus rejects her. And so every time this text comes up, I always find myself wrestling. And I often will find myself wanting to make Jesus nicer in this, right? Maybe he's just testing her. We hear that a lot about this reading, that it's a test of her faith. That's why Jesus is so mean to her. But I wonder if the actual good news isn't Jesus' harsh words, obviously, and it's not that she convinced him or that Jesus was testing her, but what if the good news is that even Jesus can make the very human mistake of judging someone, of excluding someone, of not understanding how someone else can belong in that place of healing? And what if the good news is that if even Jesus can learn from his mistake, if even Jesus can make this mistake and learn from it, then God knows I can, we can too, right? Jesus hears the hurt and the perseverance in the Syrophoenician woman's voice. He changes his mind. And I think that Jesus calls us into a space of change too. Hearing her words, well, even the dogs get the crumbs. Even the dogs get the crumbs. Even me, Jesus. Even I deserve a little bit of the scraps of your love and healing and grace. But hearing those words moves Jesus to realize maybe his own human partiality, his own mistake, and he changes his mind. He heals the woman's daughter. And this begins in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' work most particularly with those who are outside of the expected promises. This is when Jesus heads over to the Decapolis to go heal the Gentiles. And for me, that's the good news. Because my faith calls me into that kind of work with God and Jesus. Our faith calls us into God's work in the world, and just as Jesus made a mistake initially with this woman and her daughter, we'll make mistakes. But through Jesus, we always have another chance to keep trying, to do better, to keep working with God around us. We see in our readings the reminders of God's healing work in the world through Jesus, all of the ways we can make mistakes as we participate in God's work in the world. And we can see in our readings that God's work is for justice, to feed the hungry, to set the prisoners free, to protect and defend those in need, and God calls us to that work too. One of the slogans we often hear in the ELCA is God's work, our hands, right? And I just want to make sure everyone's a little bit awake here, so can we all say that together? God's work, our hands?
God's work, our hands.
Can I see your hands? Those hands. Those are the hands that God is using. Yours. It's a lot, right? I've been talking all this last couple of weeks, all summer, all year and a half through this pandemic, and every time we sit down to talk together, I hear from so many of you, my load today is just the world, right? It's the news. It's what's going on in our community around us. There's so much need, so much work to be done. And when we have James's words telling us if a brother or sister in Christ might need clothes or might need food, and you say to them, God be with you, I hope you stay warm and get plenty to eat, but don't do anything about it, then your words are nothing. And I hear that, and I hear my own conviction in that, hoping my words aren't nothing. And it's hard not to feel like that, especially when we feel overwhelmed, and especially when sometimes kindness is all that we can do. Sometimes kindness does mean a lot. But I still find myself wondering about the mistakes I've made, the mistakes we continue to make. And honestly, as much as my Lutheran self hates to admit it, I agree with James. There's a reason why I'm often disappointed in my own abilities, motivations, and even energy to join God in this work. And that disappointment, James points out, is because our faith calls us into action. Our faith in the God who made the entire universe is a faith in a God who uses us, these hands that we have, to care for that great big universe, especially for those in need. Even when our own judgments might tell us differently. Even when we struggle to see past our own personal preferences. Even the dogs receive the crumbs from the table. But when the dogs are people, we know that they deserve so much more than crumbs. For all those moments, our judgment over someone else has caused us to dismiss their need, their presence, their very being. For all the moments that we seek out those who are just like us compared to those who are different from us. For all the moments we made the same mistakes that Jesus did. The good news, there's always another chance. After Jesus heals the woman's daughter, we're given a second healing story. This time, it's a deaf man in the Decapolis, likely a Gentile, likely someone who would have normally been in that category of dogs that Jesus puts the woman in earlier. But this is a new story, another chance. And this time for Jesus, there's no hesitation, there's no judgment. I wonder if Jesus hears the words of the woman in his head, even the dogs, as he hears those begging for Jesus to heal this man, because Jesus immediately takes the man to the side and heals him. The good news is that through Jesus, we always have another chance to do better, to participate more fully in God's work around us to share more than just breadcrumbs, but through Jesus, we are always given another chance to fully invite others to the table. Jesus goes to the cross for all our judgments, all our mistakes, all our unintentional partialities, and Jesus rises from the dead, telling us not to fear, sharing healing and hope, joy and life, and calling us into God's continued work in the world. That is the good news today, that our faith is the kind of faith that gives us all this hope. Our faith in the one who gives his all to bring us life and love and forgiveness, to give us faith in chances. A faith that says nothing can stop God's work in this world, not death, not sin, not human partialities, nothing. James is right, but rather than faith without works, I think we might better understand this call as a reminder that faith without action struggles to fully express the faith we have in Jesus, because our faith calls us to act. Jesus' faith is action, because faith in Jesus is love in action. And it's God's love for every single one of us, so that none of us have to be reminded that even the dogs get the crumbs, because through Jesus there is abundance for all. We are all welcome to this table of healing, to the waters of life springing forth in the wilderness, to be opened so that we too can hear and see, so that we too, through Jesus, will always have another chance. Thanks be to God.